My name is C.W. Anderson. I'm a professor at the City University of New York and the University of Leeds in the United Kingdom. And I talk today about the history of data journalism, how journalists have used data, how it's changed over time, and what it can teach us about journalism today. So one of the big things in the news business right now is how journalists are using data and other kinds of quantitative information to tell news stories in a different way. There's data everywhere, and it's really easy for journalists to get their hands on. That's a big thing in the news business right now. I was kind of interested, is there a longer history to journalists using data in news? Have they been using it for maybe longer than the last 10 years? And it turns out that the answer is not only yes, they've been using it for a century at least. And by learning about how journalists have used data historically, we can learn a lot about how they're using it now. So I want to give kind of a history of how journalists have used data in news reporting in order to tell us about why data journalism is the way it is today. So, in the 1920s and 1930s, journalists were trying to use maps primarily to tell stories in particular ways. People would go out and they would map parts of the city, which areas were poor, which areas were rich, which areas were Protestant, which areas were Catholic, which areas were immigrant, which were not. They would map those things, and journalists would be able to tell stories using those maps. They were all hand-drawn. One thing you have to understand is that people actually filled in all this information themselves. The big change occurred in the 1960s and 1970s and then into the 1980s when it became possible for journalists to take all of that paper data and digitize it, put it on computer tape and put it eventually on computer disks and then in giant cloud computer systems. And being able to move that data from analog to digital form allowed them to use it much more easily and much more frequently to do journalism. It just became easier to access, and it became easier to get, and it became easier to analyze. So when data went from being analog to digital in the 1970s and 1980s, it was a big moment in the history of how journalists have used these tools. The hope is that, two things. The hope is that one, data journalism is more accurate, right? It's data, not someone's opinion, right? So you have cold, hard numbers that will allow journalists to report stories in new ways and get more truthful stories. So that's one, hope. I'll come back to that in a second. And two is that not only is it more accurate, but it gives a bigger picture, right? So rather than just focusing on a crime, say a crime in Eugene, right? A journalist not doing data journalism might go out and talk about that crime. Who did it, why, what weapon was used, who was injured, right? Using data, the idea is that you can then talk about crime in Eugene in general. You can talk about the trends of crime. You can talk about is crime going up or is crime going down, right? So the hope is that not only will data journalism be more accurate, it will be more it will give readers a bigger picture of what's actually happening. That's the hope, anyway. The problem is that journalism is in a crisis for a bunch of different reasons, some of which are related to each other, some of which are not. Sometimes you solve one crisis and you make the other crisis worse. So it's a really complicated situation. Journalism is in crisis because of a bunch of different factors. Some of them are economic. In other words, the business model of journalism is broken. Some of them are political. The news media is far more politicized and fragmented today than it was even 20, 30 years ago. Some of them are cultural. People don't actually believe journalism as much as they used to. People are more skeptical and they're more reluctant to believe in the truth of journalism. Some of them are technological. They're new technologies that are disrupting and changing journalism. And some of them are organizational, have to do with workflow. Reporters are being asked to do new things, new tasks. They're asked to do things more quickly. So what it means to be a journalist, the day-to-day life of a journalist has changed as well. All of those things are in crisis, and solving those crises are really hard, and usually people only like to talk about how to solve one crisis. And when you start to look at it as a bigger interconnected crisis, it can be very confusing about what we ought to do. Journalism is unique and special because it's one of the few areas of the media industry that has a democratic purpose. So when Steven Spielberg makes a movie, he may want it to be entertaining, he may want it to make a lot of money, he may hope it wins awards. It may be something that was meaningful to him, that happened to him as a child. But Steven Spielberg is not usually thinking, how can I make a movie that makes America a better place in democratic terms, right? He's not thinking to himself, how will this movie impact America politically to make democracy in America better? That's true for ads, that's true for books, that's true for all sorts of types of media. Journalism is the only type of media that's purpose is to make democracy in America work the right way. And simply having wealth and simply having a healthy economic system doesn't always mean that journalism will then go and serve that democratic purpose. It means that it could just be making a lot of money and be bad for democracy. And some people worry that that's what's happening right now. I would just say that it's important to keep in mind that the last election, the 2016 election, my talk, if I'd given it a year ago, would be very different than the talk I'm going to give tonight, because what happened in the last presidential election was very surprising. It was not surprising simply for Americans, but it was surprising for journalists as well. And that election is really forcing journalists, particularly data journalists, particularly people dealing with numbers, to think really hard about what it is they're doing and why they're doing journalism and how the kind of journalism they're doing relates to politics. So I think the big takeaway I would hope folks have from this, in addition to everything else, is simply that, things in America politically are changing really fast. And we need to try to talk about the journalism that exists now and the politics that exist now, rather than hearkening back to some golden age, in the 1950s or 1960s when things were all better, and hope we can get back to that. What we need to do is deal with the reality that we have right now and find a way to move forward from that.